lonely rancher welcomed the pregnant Apache girl the town rejected, and claimed her publicly. The merciless Arizona sun beat down on Cedar Ridge like God's own hammer against an anvil, turning the dusty main street into a shimmering mirage of heat and desperation. It was the kind of day that made decent folks seek shade and decent conversation. But Ayanna Walking Bear had neither luxury, as she trudged down the wooden boardwalk, her worn moccasins silent against the weathered planks. At 18, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of her Apache heritage, though her traditional dress had been replaced by a simple cotton skirt and blouse that couldn't quite hide the gentle swell of her belly beneath. Her long black hair, braided with small turquoise beads that caught the harsh light, framed a face that bore the exhaustion of someone who had walked too many miles with too little hope. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge watched her approach with the kind of suspicious interest usually reserved for rattlesnakes and card cheats. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, pulled her two young daughters closer to her skirts and whispered something sharp that made them stare with wide, curious eyes. Old Pete at the general store spat tobacco juice into the street and shook his head slowly, as if Ayanna's very presence was somehow offensive to the natural order of things. "Water, please," Ayanna said softly as she approached the well at the center of town, her English careful and precise despite the tremor of exhaustion in her voice. "Just water." Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, looked up from shoeing a horse and wiped his sooty hands on his leather apron. He was a big man with arms like tree trunks and a reputation for fairness, but even he hesitated when he saw her condition. "Well's for everyone, I suppose," he said finally, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the decision. "But you best move along after. This ain't the place for—" He gestured vaguely at her belly, unable to finish the sentence. Ayanna nodded gratefully and worked the pump handle with arms that shook from more than just the desert heat. The water was warm and tasted of iron, but it was the sweetest thing she'd had in days. She cupped her hands and drank deeply, then splashed some on her face and neck, letting the precious drops run down her dust-caked skin. "You looking for work?" asked Martha Collins, the seamstress, though her voice carried more suspicion than kindness. "Because we don't have anything for your kind." The word stung, but Ayanna had heard worse in the 3 weeks since she'd been cast out from her own people. Her tribe had rejected her when they learned the father of her child was a white soldier who had since disappeared into the vast territories, leaving nothing behind but shame and a growing burden she carried alone. The white settlements she'd tried had been no more welcoming to a pregnant Apache woman with nowhere to go. "I can work," Ayanna said quietly, straightening her shoulders despite the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. "I can sew, cook, clean. I learn quickly." Mrs. Henderson made a sound of disgust. "The very idea. Bringing that here among decent Christian folk. It's unseemly." "She's just a girl," said a quiet voice from behind them. Everyone turned to see Dr. William Hayes emerging from his small clinic, a thin man in his 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "And she's clearly in need of help." "She's Apache," snapped Mrs. Henderson, as if that settled the matter completely. "And carrying God knows what kind of—" "A child," Dr. Hayes interrupted firmly. "She's carrying a child, Martha, same as you did. Same as any woman does." The doctor's words hung in the hot air like a challenge, but Mrs. Henderson was not easily deterred. "It's not the same. And you know it, William Hayes. The problems this could bring to our town and the complications." Ayanna felt the familiar burn of tears behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had learned that tears only made people more uncomfortable, more eager to send her away. Instead, she straightened her spine and prepared to continue her journey to nowhere, just as she had done in a dozen other towns. That's when she noticed him. Samuel McKenna sat on his horse at the far end of the street, watching the scene unfold with the quiet intensity of a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. At 37, Sam carried himself with the weathered confidence of someone who had spent his life working the unforgiving land. But there was something in his gray eyes that spoke of deeper wounds than any desert sun could inflict. He urged his horse forward slowly, the animal's hooves raising small clouds of dust with each measured step. The townspeople fell silent as he approached, not out of fear, but out of respect for a man who kept to himself and asked nothing of anyone. "Problem here?" Sam asked, his voice gravelly from years of breathing desert air and speaking mostly to cattle and horses. No problem, Sam, Tom Bradley said quickly. Just discussing the situation. Sam's eyes found Ayana's across the dusty space between them, and for a moment the noise and heat of the town seemed to fade away. In her dark eyes he saw something that cut through all his carefully constructed walls, a desperate strength that reminded him painfully of another woman, another time, another life that had been torn away too soon. What situation would that be? Sam asked, though his gaze never left Ayana's face. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, clearly appointed as spokesperson for the town's moral outrage. This Apache girl thinks she can just waltz into Cedar Ridge expecting charity. In her condition, it's inappropriate, Samuel, and you know it. Sam dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He was not a tall man, but there was something in his presence that made him seem larger than his actual size. When he spoke, his words were measured and careful. Seems to me, he said, that a woman in need of help ought to find it in a place that calls itself civilized. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind rustling through the few scraggly mesquite trees that provided what little shade the town possessed. Ayana found herself holding her breath, hardly daring to hope that someone, anyone, might show her a moment's kindness. Sam reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a silver dollar which he handed to Tom Bradley. Give her what supplies she needs, he said simply. Food, water, whatever else. Now hold on, Sam. Mrs. Henderson protested. We can't just— I didn't ask for a town meeting, Sam interrupted, his voice carrying a quiet authority that ended the discussion. I asked Tom to help a woman who needs helping. As Tom reluctantly began gathering supplies, Sam turned back to Ayana. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair, the way his hands remained steady despite whatever storms might be raging inside him. You got somewhere to go? He asked. Ayana shook her head slowly, not trusting her voice. Sam nodded as if he had expected that answer. For a long moment he stood there in the blazing heat, wrestling with demons that only he could see. The town watched in fascination and growing unease as their most reclusive neighbor seemed to wage some internal battle. Finally, Sam McKenna made a decision that would change everything. My ranch is 5 miles north, he said quietly. You're welcome to rest there, until you figure out what comes next. The gasps and murmurs from the townspeople rose like heat waves, but Sam ignored them all. He helped Ayana gather her few possessions and assisted her onto his spare horse with the gentle care of a man who understood what it meant to be broken by the world. As they rode out of Cedar Ridge together, leaving behind a town buzzing with scandal and speculation, neither Sam nor Ayana spoke. But in the silence between them lay the first fragile seeds of something neither had dared hope for, a chance at redemption, and perhaps against all odds a chance at family. A chance. The desert stretched endlessly before them, vast and unforgiving. But for the first time in months, Ayana Walking Bear was not traveling it alone. The McKenna Ranch sprawled across the desert landscape like a testament to one man's stubborn refusal to surrender to the harsh realities of frontier life. As they crested the final ridge, Ayana could see the modest adobe house nestled against a backdrop of red rock formations, its walls the color of sunset and earth. A windmill turned lazily in the afternoon breeze, drawing precious water from deep beneath the sand, while a small herd of cattle grazed in the distance under the watchful eye of a weathered cowhand. Sam's silence during the ride had been comfortable rather than awkward, broken only by his occasional observations about the land or gentle inquiries about her comfort. Now, as they approached his home, Ayana could feel the weight of his generosity settling on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. It's not much, Sam said as he helped her down from the horse, his calloused hands steady and sure. But it's got a roof that doesn't leak and walls that keep the wind out. That's more than some can say. The house was indeed modest, but Ayana could see the care that had gone into its construction and maintenance. The wooden porch was swept clean, the windows were clear, and small details, like the hand-carved supports under the eaves, spoke of a man who took pride in his work, even when no one was watching. Mr. McKenna, Ayana began, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to thank you. I have no money to pay. Didn't ask for money, Sam interrupted gently, and didn't ask for thanks either. Just asked if you needed help. An older Mexican man emerged from the barn, his weathered face creased with concern as he took in the scene. This was Carlos Hernandez, Sam's foreman, and the closest thing to family the rancher had allowed himself since his wife's death. Carlos had worked the ranch for 15 years, and he read Sam's moods like weather patterns on the horizon. "Patron," Carlos said carefully, his English heavily accented but clear. "Is everything all right?" "Carlos, this is Ayanna," Sam said, his voice carrying a note of finality that suggested the decision was made and would not be questioned. "She'll be staying with us for a while. See that she gets settled in the guest room." Carlos nodded slowly, his dark eyes taking in Ayanna's condition with the understanding of a man who had raised 6 daughters of his own. "See, of course. Señorita, you are welcome here." The guest room was small but clean, with a single bed covered by a colorful quilt that looked hand-sewn. A wash basin sat on a simple wooden table beneath the room's only window, which looked out over the desert toward the distant mountains. It was the first real room Ayanna had slept in for weeks, and the simple luxury of it almost brought tears to her eyes. "There's soap and clean water," Sam said from the doorway, careful not to enter the room uninvited. "Maria, that's Carlos's wife. She comes by twice a week to help with the house. She'll be here tomorrow if you need anything particular." Ayanna understood his delicate reference to her pregnancy and felt a flush of gratitude for his consideration. "Thank you," she said simply because there were no words adequate for what he had done. That evening, as the desert air cooled and the first stars appeared in the vast sky, Ayanna emerged from her room to find Sam and Carlos sitting on the porch, sharing coffee in the comfortable silence of men who had worked hard all day. The smell of beans and cornbread drifted from the kitchen, where Maria had apparently left a meal before departing. "Come," Carlos said, rising from his chair with the natural hospitality of his culture. "You must eat. Is important, see?" The meal was simple but nourishing. Beans seasoned with cumin and chilies, fresh cornbread and coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. Ayanna ate slowly, savoring each bite while Sam and Carlos discussed the day's work in the easy shorthand of men who had shared many such evenings. "The water level in the north pasture is dropping," Carlos reported. "May need to move the herd closer to the main well." Sam nodded thoughtfully. "Drought's been hard this year, harder than most." He glanced at Ayanna, who was listening quietly while she ate. "You know anything about cattle?" The question surprised her. "Some. My grandfather raised horses for the cavalry, before the Troubles. Different animals, but same principles," Sam said. "If you're staying, you might as well learn to be useful." It was a practical statement, but Ayanna heard the underlying message. He was offering her not just shelter, but purpose, a place in the world, however temporary. Over the following days, a routine developed that felt as natural as breathing. Ayanna proved to be a quick learner and willing worker despite her advancing pregnancy. She helped Maria with the household tasks, learning to cook the hearty meals that sustained working men. She mended clothes with the precise stitching skills her grandmother had taught her, and she even assisted Carlos with some of the gentler ranch work. But it was with Sam that she found the most unexpected connection. In the evenings, when the work was done and the desert air grew cool, they would sit on the porch and talk about everything and nothing. Sam spoke of his plans for the ranch, his concerns about the changing times, his memories of the land when it was wilder and more dangerous. Ayanna shared stories of her childhood, her grandmother's wisdom, and the complex world of being caught between two cultures that neither fully accepted her. "Your wife," Ayanna said one evening, after Sam had mentioned Rebecca in passing. "How long has she been gone?" Sam was quiet for so long that Ayanna thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. 4 years come September. She was carrying our child when the fever took them both." The words hung in the desert air like a prayer or a curse. Ayanna felt the weight of his loss, understanding now why he had shown such kindness to a pregnant woman with nowhere to go. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Life's got a way of taking what you love most," Sam replied. "But it's also got a way of bringing things you didn't know you needed." Meanwhile, in Cedar Ridge, the gossip mill churned with speculation about Sam McKenna and his unusual house guest. Mrs. Henderson made it her personal mission to spread word of the scandal to anyone who would listen, while others wondered if the lonely rancher had finally lost his mind. "It's not natural," she declared to anyone within earshot. "A decent Christian man taking in a heathen woman in that condition. What will people think?" But Dr. Hayes, who had made a point of riding out to check on Ayanna's health, returned with glowing reports of a woman who was thriving under Sam's care. The baby was healthy, Ayana was gaining proper weight, and there was a peace about her that spoke of a soul finally finding rest. She's good for him too, the doctor confided to his wife over dinner. Sam's been dead inside since Rebecca passed. First time I've seen him truly alive in years. As the weeks passed, the bond between Sam and Ayana deepened beyond simple charity. They worked together with an ease that surprised them both, anticipating each other's needs and movements like partners who had been together for years rather than weeks. When Ayana's back ached from the baby's weight, Sam would wordlessly take over her tasks. When Sam struggled with the loneliness that had plagued him for years, Ayana's quiet presence seemed to ease the burden. But their peaceful existence was about to face its first real test. Word had reached the reservation that one of their own was living with a white rancher, and the tribal council was not pleased. At the same time, the town of Cedar Ridge was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the arrangement, led by Mrs. Henderson's relentless campaign of moral outrage. The storm was gathering on the horizon, and soon Sam McKenna would have to decide just how far he was willing to go to protect the woman who had brought unexpected light back into his world. As if sensing the approaching conflict, Ayana stood in the doorway of the ranch house one evening, her hand resting on her growing belly, watching Sam work with the horses in the corral. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine that this peace could last forever. But peace, she had learned, was a luxury that women like her were rarely allowed to keep. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday morning with the dust and thunder of horses ridden hard across the desert. Ayana was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she saw them. 5 Apache warriors cresting the ridge, their painted ponies dancing with barely contained energy. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the lead rider, her brother Thomas, known to the tribe as Strongwolf. Sam emerged from the barn at the sound of approaching hoofbeats, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle he kept nearby. But when he saw Ayana's face, pale despite her copper skin, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and longing, he understood this was not a raiding party. This was family business, and that made it infinitely more complicated. Ayana, Thomas called out in Apache as he dismounted, his voice carrying the authority of a war chief despite his youth. You will come home now. The council has decided. Sam didn't speak Apache, but he didn't need to understand the words to grasp their meaning. The tension in Ayana's posture, the way she instinctively stepped closer to the house, to him, told him everything he needed to know. I cannot, Ayana replied in English, a deliberate choice that included Sam in the conversation, and asserted her right to make her own decisions. This is my home now. Thomas's eyes flicked to Sam with barely concealed contempt. This white man's house? You forget who you are, sister. You forget your people. My people cast me out, Ayana said, her voice gaining strength. You told me I brought shame to the tribe, that my child would be neither Apache nor white, belonging nowhere. Now you want me back? The child changes things, Thomas admitted reluctantly. The council has spoken with the spirits. Your son, you don't know it's a son, Ayana interrupted. Your child will be raised Apache, taught our ways. The white blood will be forgotten. Sam had remained silent during this exchange, understanding that this was Ayana's battle to fight. But when Thomas spoke of taking her child, of erasing half of who the baby was, something cold and dangerous settled in his chest. Ma'am seems to have made her choice, Sam said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that experienced men recognized as more threatening than any shout. Thomas turned his full attention to Sam for the first time, taking in the weathered rancher with the calculating gaze of a warrior. You think to speak for my sister, white man? Don't speak for anybody but myself, Sam replied evenly. But I reckon a woman's got the right to choose where she lives and how she raises her child. Rights? Thomas laughed bitterly. You speak of rights while you steal our women, while you take what is not yours? Nobody's taking anything, Sam said, his patience beginning to fray. Your sister came here of her own free will, and she's free to leave the same way. But that's her choice to make, not yours or mine. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with Carlos and his 2 ranch hands emerging from various buildings, their hands near their weapons. The Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, but Sam could see the tension in their postures, the way their hands rested near their weapons. 3 days, Thomas said finally, his eyes boring into Ayana's. I give you 3 days to remember who you are. Then we come back and you will choose us or them, your people or your shame. Without another word, the Apache warriors wheeled their horses and thundered away, leaving behind only dust and the echo of an ultimatum that would change everything. That afternoon brought a different kind of trouble. A delegation from Cedar Ridge arrived in a buckboard wagon, led by Mrs. Henderson and accompanied by the town's mayor, banker, and preacher. They came armed not with weapons, but with the righteous indignation of those who believed they held the moral high ground. Samuel McKenna, Mayor Patterson called out as he climbed down from the wagon, his considerable bulk making the vehicle creak with relief. "We need to talk." Sam emerged from the house where he had been comforting a shaken Ayanna, his face set in the hard lines of a man preparing for battle. "Talk away, Patterson. This is my land." Reverend Mitchell, a thin man with burning eyes and the fervor of someone who had never doubted his own righteousness, stepped forward. "Samuel, you're a good man. We all know that. But this situation has gone too far." "What situation would that be, Reverend?" Mrs. Henderson couldn't contain herself any longer. "Don't play innocent with us, Sam McKenna. That Apache woman living in your house carrying God knows what kind of child, bringing shame on this entire community." "The only shame I see," Sam said quietly, "is a bunch of so-called Christians turning away a woman in need." "She's not just any woman," the banker Wilson interjected nervously. "She's Apache, Sam, and unmarried, and pregnant. The implications of what exactly?" Reverend Mitchell cleared his throat. "Samuel, surely you must see how this appears to the community. A unmarried woman living in your home, in her condition. People are talking. They're saying that perhaps that the child might be—" The suggestion hung in the air like poison, and Sam felt something dark and violent stir in his chest. "You got something to say, Mitchell, then say it plain. They're saying the baby might be yours," Mrs. Henderson said bluntly, apparently deciding that subtlety was wasted. "That you've been carrying on with that Indian girl and now you're trying to make it respectable by taking her in." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind through the desert scrub and the distant lowing of cattle. Sam's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but his voice remained dangerously calm. "Let me make something clear," he said, each word precise as a rifle shot. "Miss Walking Bear came to my ranch looking for help and I gave it to her, same as I'd do for any soul in need. What you people choose to think about that says more about you than it does about me. But Sam," Mayor Patterson tried a more conciliatory approach, "surely you can see our position. The town's reputation." "The town's reputation?" Sam's voice rose for the first time. "What about human decency? What about Christian charity? Thought that was supposed to matter more than gossip and small-minded thinking." From inside the house, Ayanna listened to every word, her heart breaking for the good man who was being punished for showing her kindness. She had brought this trouble to his door, had exposed him to the cruel judgment of people who should have known better. The confrontation continued for another hour, with the townspeople making increasingly desperate attempts to convince Sam to send Ayanna away. They offered to pay for her passage to California, suggested she could find work in one of the larger cities, even hinted that there were institutions that could take care of women in her situation. But Sam McKenna was as immovable as the desert mountains. "She stays as long as she wants to stay," he said finally. "And if you don't like it, you can take your business elsewhere." As the delegation prepared to leave, Mrs. Henderson played her final card. "You're making a mistake, Samuel. A mistake that will cost you everything. Mark my words. No good will come of this." After they left, Sam found Ayanna sitting by the window in her room, tears streaming down her face. "I should go," she said without looking at him. "I should have gone before it got this bad." "Where?" Sam asked quietly. "Where would you go?" "Anywhere. It doesn't matter. I won't let you lose everything because of me." Sam sat down in the chair across from her, his weathered hands clasped between his knees. "Ayanna, look at me." When she finally met his eyes, he saw the same desperate strength that had first drawn him to help her, but now it was mixed with something else, a fierce protectiveness that matched his own. 4 years ago, I lost everything that mattered to me," he said slowly. "Wife, child, any hope of a future worth living. I've been walking around dead ever since, just going through the motions. Then you showed up, and for the first time in years, I remembered what it felt like to be alive. Sam, I'm not finished. His voice was gentle but firm. I don't care what your brother says. I don't care what the town thinks. You belong here, Ayanna. You and your child both. And I'll be damned if I let anyone take that away from us. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. For a moment, Ayanna allowed herself to hope that perhaps, against all odds, she had found not just shelter, but home. But outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the real test of Sam McKenna's resolve was yet to come. The dawn of the third day arrived with an ominous stillness that seemed to press against the desert like a held breath. Ayanna stood at her bedroom window, watching the eastern horizon for signs of her brother's return, while Sam prepared for what might be the most important day of his life. He had spent the sleepless hours before sunrise walking the perimeter of his ranch, thinking about choices and consequences, about the difference between existing and truly living. By mid-morning, the heat was already oppressive, but it was nothing compared to the tension that filled the ranch house. Carlos had positioned his men strategically around the property, not for war but for protection, while Maria fussed over Ayanna with the worried attention of a mother hen. "Señorita," Maria said in her heavily accented English, "perhaps you should rest. The stress, it is not good for the baby." But Ayanna couldn't rest. The child within her seemed to sense her agitation, moving restlessly as if responding to her quickened heartbeat. She had made her decision during the long night hours, a choice that would require more courage than she had ever summoned before. The Apache warriors appeared first, materializing from the desert heat like wraiths. Thomas rode at their head, his face painted for war, though whether against enemies or for ceremony, Sam couldn't tell. Behind them, as if drawn by some invisible signal, came the delegation from Cedar Ridge, bigger this time, including nearly 24 townspeople who had come to witness what they clearly expected to be Ayanna's departure. Sam stepped out onto his porch, his rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm. Not threatening, but unmistakably present. Ayanna emerged beside him, and the sight of her standing there, chin raised with quiet defiance, sent murmurs through both groups of onlookers. "Time is up, sister," Thomas called out in Apache, then switched to English for the benefit of the white observers. "You will come now." "No," Ayanna said, her voice carrying clearly across the dusty yard. "I will not." Thomas dismounted slowly, his movements careful and controlled. "You choose the white man over your own blood? Over your own people?" "I choose my child's future," Ayanna replied, her hand moving protectively to her belly. "I choose a home where she will be loved for who she is, not judged for what she represents." "She?" Thomas's eyes widened slightly. The spirit spoke truly. "A daughter comes." From the crowd of townspeople, Mrs. Henderson's voice rose sharp and cutting. "This is all very touching, but it doesn't change anything. That woman cannot stay here corrupting our community with her situation." Sam had heard enough. He stepped forward, and something in his bearing made both groups fall silent. "Seems to me," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had made peace with his choices, "that you're all missing the point." He looked directly at Thomas. "You want to take Ayanna back to prove something about Apache pride and tradition? But throwing out a pregnant woman isn't tradition. It's fear. Fear that maybe the old ways aren't the only ways." Then he turned to the townspeople. "And you want her gone because you're afraid of what people might think, afraid of change, afraid of admitting that maybe showing kindness to someone different might actually be the Christian thing to do. Now see here, McKenna." Mayor Patterson began, but Sam cut him off. "I'm not finished." Sam's voice grew stronger, more certain. "Both of you talk about what's right and proper and traditional, but neither of you seems much interested in what's best for that baby girl growing inside her mother." "Well, I am." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that made everyone in the yard go perfectly still. "Ayanna Walking Bear," he said, his voice rough with emotion but clear as mountain water. "Will you marry me?" The desert seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind stopped moving through the sagebrush as Sam opened the box to reveal a simple gold band. Not the elaborate ring he had given Rebecca years ago, but something new. Something that belonged to this moment and this woman. "Sam," Ayanna whispered, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been hope. "You don't have to." "I'm not doing this because I have to," Sam interrupted gently. I'm doing it because I want to, because you and your daughter deserve a name, a home, and a man who'll stand by you no matter what." The silence stretched until Thomas broke it with a harsh laugh. "You think marriage to a white man will solve everything? You think papers signed by their government will make you one of them?" "I think," Ayanna said, finding her voice at last, "that love matters more than the color of someone's skin or the traditions of their people." She looked directly at her brother. "And I think my daughter deserves to grow up in a house where she's wanted, not where she's seen as a symbol of shame." She turned to Sam, her dark eyes shining with unshed tears. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." The chaos that erupted was immediate and predictable. Mrs. Henderson began loudly proclaiming that this was exactly the sort of scandal she had predicted, while several of the Apache warriors reached for their weapons. But Thomas held up a hand, stopping his men cold. "You are no longer my sister," he said to Ayanna, his voice heavy with finality. "You are dead to us." "No," Ayanna replied with quiet strength. "I am finally alive." Reverend Mitchell, his face red with indignation, stepped forward. "I will not perform this ceremony. It's unnatural." "Then I will," said a new voice. Dr. Hayes emerged from the crowd, having arrived unnoticed during the confrontation. "I'm a justice of the peace, duly appointed by the territorial government. I can marry them right here, right now, if they wish." Sam looked at Ayanna, asking the question with his eyes. She nodded, and he took her hand in his calloused palm. "Then let's do this properly," Sam said. "Carlos, bring out the witness papers." What followed was the most unusual wedding ceremony Cedar Ridge had ever witnessed. With 24 hostile townspeople and 5 Apache warriors looking on, Dr. Hayes performed a simple civil ceremony under the blazing Arizona sun. Carlos and Maria served as witnesses, their faces glowing with joy for the patron who had finally found his way back to life. When Sam slipped the ring onto Ayanna's finger, she felt something settle into place inside her chest. Not just security, but belonging. And when she looked into his gray eyes as he kissed her gently, she saw not pity or duty, but genuine affection, and the promise of something deeper to come. "Well," Dr. Hayes announced with satisfaction, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. May God bless this union and the child it will protect." The townspeople began to disperse, muttering among themselves but unable to argue with the legality of what they had witnessed. Thomas and his warriors prepared to leave as well, but not before the new war chief delivered one final message. "You have chosen your path, sister who was," he said. "Walk it well, for there is no returning." "I know," Ayanna replied, "and I'm not afraid." As the dust settled and the various parties departed, Sam and Ayanna found themselves alone on their porch, married and facing an uncertain but shared future. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Mrs. McKenna," Sam said experimentally, testing how the name sounded. "It will take some getting used to," Ayanna admitted with a small smile. "But I like the sound of it." "Good," Sam said, pulling her gently against his side. "Because you're stuck with it now." 3 months later, when little Sarah McKenna made her entrance into the world during a spectacular desert thunderstorm, she was welcomed by parents who had learned that family wasn't just about blood or tradition, but about choice and commitment and the courage to stand up for what was right. Dr. Hayes, who delivered the baby, proclaimed her the most beautiful child he had ever seen, which might have been bias, given that he had presided over the union that made her legitimate. But as Sam held his daughter for the first time, looking down at her tiny face that perfectly blended her parents' heritage, he knew the doctor was absolutely right. The town of Cedar Ridge eventually came to accept the McKenna family, though it took time and the undeniable evidence that Sam and Ayanna's love was genuine and lasting. Mrs. Henderson never quite approved, but even she had to admit that little Sarah was a delightful child who brought joy wherever she went. Thomas never returned, but other members of Ayanna's extended family occasionally visited the ranch, slowly building bridges between worlds that had seemed irreconcilably different. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the desert air was soft and the stars seemed close enough to touch, Sam and Ayanna would sit on their porch and marvel at the unexpected turns that had brought them together. Love, they learned, had a way of making the impossible seem inevitable. and of turning two lonely souls into a family strong enough to weather any storm the frontier could bring. In the end, the lonely rancher had found more than just someone to welcome. He had found his heart's true home. What did you think of Sam and Ayana's incredible journey from strangers to soulmates? This powerful story of love conquering prejudice and fear shows us that sometimes the greatest courage comes from opening our hearts to those who need us most. If this tale of frontier romance and redemption touched your heart, let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how Sam's simple act of kindness changed both their lives forever. Don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed this emotional story, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of love, courage, and hope from America's untamed past. Your support helps us bring these unforgettable stories to life.